Hello and welcome to the lecture, Immigration Patterns in the 20th Century. My name is Leon Sultan and I am a teacher of AP Human Geography at Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco, California. So this is what we call a stimulus question because this question relies on interpreting a graph. So this is the graph that acts as the stimulus for this question, so it's very important that you're able to interpret the trends on this graph. So we can see, for one, this graph only covers the year 1900 to 1998, so it's not the entire history of immigration in the United States, nor is it the entire history of immigration in the world. It's limited to the United States. So it's very important whenever we see a graph or chart of some kind that we read it carefully and see exactly what it is identifying, and then we look for trends. So the easiest trends or patterns to spot are the early spike in immigration here in this period between 1900 and 1920. So we see a pretty large spike in immigration there. Then we see a huge decrease or trough in immigration, and we can attribute that to anti-immigrant policies that were passed in the 1920s in combination with the Great Depression and World War II. Finally, we see another huge spike here in the 1980s, 1990s at that time. So those are the major trends that we can see in this graph, and these are important to understand in terms of answering this question. So the first part of this question is identify the source areas and push factors for the early 20th century immigration, political, economic, and socio-cultural, as well as changes in the U.S. economy that acted as pull factors for this immigration wave. So we are dealing specifically and we're targeting this immigration wave, which is the beginning of the 20th century. It's very important that we don't get confused between the two separate immigration waves. So with this immigration wave, we're going to look at political, economic, and socio-cultural factors. This is a reminder, political factors are things that have to do with government, laws, presidents, legislatures, elections, ideology, war, military, opposition to the government, etc. Economic factors are anything to do with money, jobs, employment, industry, workers, poverty, etc. Social and cultural factors are things that have to do with ethnicity, race, religion, education, migration, language, gender roles, etc. For this topic, we are not going to go into environmental factors, although oftentimes environmental factors can be a push factor in terms of immigration. So for the early 20th century, the source areas were predominantly in Europe. In terms of pure numbers of immigrants, the vast majority were coming from Europe. And specifically, they were coming from two regions in Europe. They were coming from Southern Europe and they were coming from Eastern Europe. Specifically, we're looking at Italy, Greece, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and some of the smaller countries as well. But in terms of numbers, these are the major areas. Now we're going to look at push factors. So what was going on in these areas at this time to force people to leave their homes? So one big push factor at this time was war. Not just World War I, but also other small regional wars that had occurred prior to had pushed countries and empires to create forced military service. So even in times of peace, people were forced to serve in the military. Many people didn't like this and they wanted to leave for that reason. Other major push factors were economic. At this time in Europe, there was a lot of poverty. Okay, this poverty led to famine. It also led to a lack of opportunity. People didn't necessarily see a future for themselves, living especially in rural places in Southern and Eastern Europe. And so they saw the promise of employment and steady work in the United States as being enough to get them to get up and leave their homes and try something new. Finally, we have social and cultural factors, and the major push factor here was religious persecution of Jewish people in Eastern Europe. So Jewish people had been experiencing persecution for many hundreds of years, and this is not the same as the Holocaust. Very important to understand. The Holocaust comes much later. Holocaust happens in the 1930s and 1940s when there was little to no immigration from Eastern Europe to the United States. So this is pre-Holocaust. And there were things like attacks on Jewish villages, which are called pogroms, and other forms of persecution. So a lot of Jewish people fled at this time due to this. Now, the changes that were happening in the U.S. economy were that the United States had undergone industrialization, and there were many, many new businesses and factories opening up. Much of the work in the U.S. was still being done by hand, And so we needed people to fill these factories. So there was a huge demand for laborers. So to summarize, the US had already undergone industrialization. Many new factories were opening up, and immigrants were needed to work in these factories. So these are all pull factors that contributed to this major migration wave in the early 20th century. So going on to the second part of this question, it's examining the major migration wave that happened in the later part of the 20th century, in the 1980s and 1990s. So we're going to look for source and push factors, and then we're going to look at changes in the US economy that act as pull factors. So the source areas for this migration wave are quite different than in the early 20th century. For the late 20th century, we're looking at two major regions, the first of which is Latin America, specifically Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Nicaragua. These are countries with major amounts of immigrants coming in the 1980s and 1990s. The second region that we're going to look at is Asia. So especially the countries of China, Vietnam, Korea, and the Philippines. These are major contributors to migration in the United States in the 1980s and 90s. So we'll look at push factors first. The first push factors that we're going to look at are political. At this time in the 1980s, especially in Central America, there were many civil wars going on. Again, forced military service, as well as a lot of guerrilla groups who also forced people into military service, and a lot of people didn't want to participate in the wars or found themselves being on the receiving end of violence. So that really pushed a lot of people out. In addition, the Civil War or Vietnam War that happened in the 1960s and 70s, and then the end result of that also pushed a lot of people out. Finally, there was a flee from communism, from Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, as well as from China. The next set of push factors that we're going to look at are economic. So the major push factor at this time with this immigration wave would have been poverty. And you can combine that with lack of opportunity and lack of jobs, especially in rural areas, really caused people to want to migrate in large numbers. Finally, social cultural push factors. The major one here that we're looking at is lack of educational opportunities. Especially in rural areas, it's very rare to find schools that go beyond the 5th grade, and especially difficult to find universities. So lack of educational opportunities played a big role. All those were push factors. Now we're going to look at pull factors. The way that the United States economy has been changing since World War II really has been moving more towards a tertiary sector or service-based economy. So many of the jobs that are available today are not in factories, but are actually in service industries. And many migrants actually come to the United States to perform these jobs. So to summarize, the US has shifted to a service-based or post-industrial economy. Many new jobs were available in fields such as construction, service and restaurant jobs, and the tech industry. And many migrants came to the United States in order to work in these industries. And that's how we ended up with the migration wave of the late 20th century. So that's the entire lecture. Again, the lecture is entitled Immigration Patterns in the 20th Century. My name is Leon Sultan. I'm a teacher at Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco, California. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below. Thanks for watching.